Hey everyone, welcome back to Behind the Veil. And in this episode, we are going to be going over some, let's just say, very controversial topics. But real quick, before we do that, I want to show you guys one of the products on our website. Here it is. It is a travel mug, and it says it was a temporary commandment with a picture of a coffee cup. And I find this very entertaining. We've worked very hard on all of these products. These are all limited edition products from this last October conference. This is just one of the products. If you want to check out all the other amazing products we have regarding this last conference with some very fun quotes, make sure you check out our website, churchexpositor.com. Links down below in the description. This is, like I said, this is just one of our limited edition products. So if you want to check them out, do so very quickly, very soon, because they're only going to be here for a short amount of time. But without further ado, let's dive into today's episode. And I want to start off this episode by asking a few questions. First, what really led to the exodus of Nauvoo? Was it as cut and dry as the church would like its members to believe? Or was it due to evidence of members of the church robbing from the Gentiles, counterfeiting money, and engaging in other illegal activity? Stay tuned, because throughout this episode, we are going to be unraveling a very tangled web of Mormon connections to counterfeiting gangs, and we even get into some gruesome, let's just say unaliving, of a young woman in New York, committed by someone in Brigham Young's family, and another unaliving connected to the Mormon counterfeiting ring. You're not going to want to miss this wild adventure into the, let's just say, a mafia-style criminal activity by high-ranking leaders of the Mormon Church. And we're going to start off with Joseph Smith. And the reason why we're starting with Joseph Smith is because we kind of want to set the stage of the whole counterfeiting ring in the Mormon leadership.
It actually starts with Joseph Smith Sr.
Joseph Smith Sr. I apologize. I meant to say
Yeah.
Joseph Smith Sr. Thank you so much. So, yeah, the illegal activity among the Mormons, like we said, beginning with Joseph Smith Sr. Thank you so much for correcting me. So the earliest available evidence for counterfeiting begins, like we said, Joseph Smith Sr., as he was named in at least 2 court cases involving passing counterfeit bills in 1807. The first court case was Vermont State Treasurer versus Benaiah Woodward, and also the state of Vermont versus Benaiah Woodward. So we got the state treasurer and then the state of Vermont themselves. 2 different cases here. And so how did Joseph Smith Sr. avoid jail time? Well, Honorable Daniel Woodward, who was the judge of the Windsor County Court in Vermont, was quoted as saying in a letter to editors of the Boston Transcript. It says, quote, "Joseph Smith Sr. was at times engaged in hunting for Captain Kidd's buried treasure, and he also became implicated with one Jack Downing in counterfeiting money, but turned state's evidence and escaped penalty." So Judge Woodward makes it very clear here that Joseph Smith Sr. only avoided jail time because he turned in state's evidence. So basically, he ratted on these other members he was counterfeiting with. We also have a former judge stated in part, quote, "Joseph Smith Sr. lived in Vermont, connected with a bunch of counterfeiters, came to Mohawk River, eloped, and seduced a married woman." Oh, that seems a very common thing for these men to do. Anyway, so eloped to Canada, then came to Pennsylvania State. I firmly believe proof affidavits may be had to identify, like father, like son. So this statement from the judge is recorded in the Illinois State Historical Society Library in the Jonathan Baldwin collection. His statement shows that both Joseph Smith Sr. and Jr. were involved in illicit activities.
Yeah. And I think that's really important because Joseph Smith was kind of born into this situation and clearly continued on with it.
Mm-hmm.
So before any of this, Joseph Smith Sr. and William Cowdery Jr., who was Oliver Cowdery's father, were reported to have been a part of a curious band of, quote, rodsmen and counterfeiters known as the Wood Scrape Group, or the New Israelites, which I find that really interesting as you get into Mormon theology and all of that. this idea of being the new Israelites, the new Jerusalem, that kind of stuff. So this is what their kind of counterfeiting band was called. They were near Middletown, Vermont between 1800 and 1802. And I also find it interesting that we have both Joseph Smith's father and Oliver Cowdery's father involved in counterfeiting. And then they were, eventually involved in the very early foundings of the LDS Church, which is also very curious. LDS historian and BYU professor D. Michael Quinn states this, quote, "Civil and family records demonstrate that the leaders of Vermont's Woodscrape group originated in Connecticut, and that the Woodscrape's rodsman Winchell and Walters the magician of Palmyra originated in adjacent neighborhoods in Connecticut. In those same neighborhoods, there were familial connections with 3 other associates of Joseph Smith in New York's folk magic. The Orrin Porter Rockwell family, we know that name, he was a hitman for Brigham Young, Samuel Lawrence, and Alva Beeman. All the families originated in Connecticut and obviously were in touch with each other even after they moved from Connecticut. The Woodscrape group was reported to have harbored reputed counterfeiters Justice Winchell, known as Wingate, and Ephraim Wood. Winchell, or Wingate, was a fugitive from justice from Orange County, Vermont, where he had been engaged in counterfeiting. So again, we have all these connection with these counterfeiting gangs and people in this general area. You can see very clearly by this evidence that Joseph Smith Sr. was deeply embedded in counterfeiting in the very early 1800s. Joseph Smith Jr. joined his father in his treasure digging exploits and counterfeiting when he became a teenager. It's no surprise that Joseph Smith Jr. would also join his father in this counterfeiting operation as well. Isaac Hale, who was Emma's father, condemned Joseph for being involved with a group of men engaged in illegal business activities. Well, now we can even more clearly see why he was so bothered by this. A Reverend Laban Clark, and I just want to pause here. Laban, have we heard that before? In the Book of Mormon, there's a man named Laban. If you start putting pieces together, you can see that the names in the Book of Mormon come from Joseph Smith's life. Anyway, Reverend Laban Clark remembered Winchell, or Wingate, at once and stated, "It was the name of a man who was detected about 2 years before in Bradford, Vermont, in milling counterfeit dollars. My father, having been selectman of the town at the time, I had known the case well." Clark was sure that the Woodscrape affair was a, quote, movement to cover up a counterfeiting scheme, and everyone that he talked to about it concurred. So again, we have a lot of people talking about these individuals being involved in counterfeiting. In this brief overview, we've established the counterfeiting operations known among Joseph Smith's father, as well as Oliver Cowdery's father. These 2 early leaders in the Mormon Church grew up in families engaged in various criminal behavior. Like we've talked about the treasure digging, the glass looking, and the court cases involving that in previous episodes if you want to check those out. But for the sake of our topic today, we are going to focus solely on the counterfeiting aspect of this because there's a lot of other criminal activity. We're just not going to talk about that in this episode. Joseph Smith continued with his fraudulent activities when he founded the unchartered. So we're going to kind of jump now to their unchartered and therefore very illegal Kirtland Safety Society anti-bank in Ohio in 1836. The Kirtland Safety Society began issuing its own small denomination notes, which was in direct violation of the anti-inflation laws, which forbid such denominations at the time. And here's the thing, the fact that Joseph Smith had connections with counterfeiters and connections with this type of a thing makes it very easy for him to know how to start this safety society anti-bank and start printing notes. He would have had to have some sort of connections to get plates and other technology to be able to do this. You'd have to have some sort of counterfeiting connections in order to do that. The following quote is found in secret combinations, evidence of early Mormon counterfeiting. And she states, the Kirtland Anti-Bank began issuing $1, $2, and $3 bills almost immediately after Oliver Cowdery returned from Philadelphia in January of 1837 with $150,000 in already printed notes. After those were distributed, they issued more notes using the same engraving plates Cowdery obtained in New York City. So now we're getting some connections to counterfeiting rings in the New York City area. This is the first place where we're getting this connection between counterfeiting operations out of New York City and the Mormon counterfeiting operations that were going on in the early 1800s. Later in the podcast, when we detail the unaliving of a woman by a member of Brigham Young's family in New York City, they owned an apartment in New York City. And you're going to kind of see evidence of different connections and ties to other counterfeiting gangs and other things going on in New York City in connection with the LDS Church.
Mm-hmm. And jumping back to the Kirkland Safety Society anti-banking company, they failed to obtain a charter for a bank from the states, and therefore it led them to establish it as an anti-bank, which it led to charges of illegal banking and issuing fraudulent banknotes against Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon. Joseph and Sidney Rigdon were both fined $1,000, or the equivalent of $34,000 in today's money if you account for inflation. And according to the anti-bank officer Cyrus Smalling, Joseph Smith ordered his followers to exchange illegal Kirkland dollars at 50 cents on the dollar for the notes of legitimate banks. Brigham Young was said to have passed off $40,000 worth of banknotes.
That's a lot of money back then.
It absolutely is.
I mean, you're looking in the millions.
Mm-hmm. And that was just Brigham Young. We also have John F. Boykman, who passed off $20,000. And then Apostle Luke Johnson, we know in some of these accounts he passed off money. It's just we were unable to determine exactly how much he passed off. But according to Cyrus Smalling, they continued to pass and sell the worthless stuff until they sold it at 12.5 cents on the dollar and bought a section of land in Illinois with the proceeds.
Great. Let's buy stuff with proceeds of counterfeiting. Great.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
And we got Mrs. Alfred Morley. She reported that Joe's brother Bill, Leonard Rich, Julius Granger, Amasa Bonney, and his brother-in-law, Mr. Booth, would know of Mormons moving to Kirkland from the east and would intercept them and say they were going east and induce them to exchange their eastern money for Mormon money, which they could use in Kirkland. Many were swindled by them. And here we got Brigham Young entering into the picture with the illegal banking system at the Kirkland Safety Society, where we have a statement from Cyrus Smalling claiming that Brigham Young passed off, like we said, $40,000 of illegal banknotes, which, like we said, it's so much money. If we account, like, in today's money, that would be just over $1.3 million just from Brigham Young. That's a lot of money to pass off in illegal banking notes. And we got Frederick G. Williams testified that Oliver Cowdery had told him that one of the Mormon followers could compound metal and make dyes, and that he could make money so that it could not be detected. And according to Joseph Smith, he and Rigdon had warned Cowdery to leave Kirkland when they learned of a warrant against him for being engaged in making a purchase of bogus money and dyes. According to Williams' testimony, the skilled dye maker among the Mormons was named Davis. This man was probably Marvel C. Davis, who was a physician with metallurgical skills among the Kirkland Mormons. And as we continue with all this mounting evidence that Mormonism was infiltrated with counterfeiters, we come to a statement made by Thomas Sharp, who was an editor of the Warsaw Signal, and this was published on July 10th, 1844. It says that Mormon aggressions on the rights and property of their neighbors, including harboring counterfeiters, horse thieves, and blacklegs, was the motivation for the assassination of the Smith brothers, not religious prejudice.
You got to love their prejudice claims. They love it. The persecution complex of Mormons. They
Absolutely.
still have it, right? We're
Oh
going to
yeah.
talk about that. So, LDS members of the church have always had a persecution complex. And this comes from Joseph Smith because that's what he always claimed. Every time that he was in legal trouble, every time there were mobs, every time. It's not that he was making moves on a 15-year-old girl and that's why a mom's tarring and feathering him. No. It's persecution for his religious beliefs, right? Kind of this like look over here, not over here kind of thing. I'm being persecuted. So they always claim religious persecution for any resistance that their people face. And I want to give an example of modern day that's happened this year in Fairview, Texas, where the LDS Church was asked to simply comply with local building codes for their temple. That's all. They're like, just abide by our laws in this town. Very basic, very simple. The LDS Church leaders staunchly refused to follow the building codes. And when the exception to the building codes is denied because the building doesn't fit within their codes, members begin proclaiming religious persecution and all this stuff. This persecution complex goes back to the very beginning. Like I said, with Joseph Smith. And he would even claim that evil men induced by Satan were persecuting him and trying to destroy him. It was Satan trying to destroy the church, right? Members are still saying that about the whole Fairview, Texas thing as well. Oh, it's Satan trying to prevent this temple from going in. So, yeah, it's just interesting how these attitudes have been cultivated over hundreds of years and are still being used today. So, in reality, back then, the people grew tired of the Mormons robbing and plundering them. Like we said, they believed that it was God's property and God was giving it to them from the Gentiles. They were also engaging in many other illegal activities. So let's continue on with the counterfeiting side of this. The following year, on December 18th, 1845, a grand jury brought federal indictments for counterfeiting against Edward Bonney, Marinus G. Eaton, and Joseph H. Jackson, along with 9 other Nauvoo leaders, including Theodore Turley, Augustus Barton, Peter Hawes. We will hear some of these names a little bit later on. Brigham Young, Willard Richards, John Taylor, Parley P. Pratt, Orson Hyde, and Carlos Gove. So if you have been a member of the LDS Church at any point, you're going to recognize those names. Obviously Brigham Young, but Willard Richards, John Taylor was a prophet, Parley P. Pratt, Orson Hyde. A lot of these are very high-ranking members of the church that are being indicted for counterfeiting. Brigham Young, along with these other leaders of the Mormon church, defied authorities. In December of 1845, when authorities had come to the temple to arrest Brigham Young, William Miller disguised himself as Brigham Young, put on his hat and his cloak, and went outside of the temple looking like Brigham Young, deceiving the deputy U.S. Marshal into believing that he was Brigham Young, and he was arrested. Obviously, he was released when the officers figure out that he was not Brigham Young. This has become known as the bogus Brigham affair. Young denied the counterfeiting connections, but later exclaimed that tricking the U.S. Marshal was one of the best jokes ever perpetrated, in quotes. That was exactly what he said. And you can read that in the History of the Church in December 1845. I believe it's in volume 7, pages 549 or 551. It's also in the Journal of Discourses. So you can see that quote for yourself. Conveniently, the grand jury records of the indictments of the Mormon church leaders, including Brigham Young, were destroyed in a fire. I don't know if I think that was an accident or coincidence. We'll let you decide, but it's quite curious. So we have no way of knowing what led to the charges because the documents, there are some newspaper reports, so we do get a little bit of information, but no one can get the court documents because they were destroyed. So we do have in the Daily National Intelligencer reported that the indictments charge that Joseph Smith, number 1, used to work at the business with his own hands. Number 2, which means counterfeiting, that the amount counterfeited was immense. Number three, the business had been carried on for some years along with other details. That's all we got, unfortunately. But it is quite interesting that they're saying that the amount of money that the LDS leaders of the church had counterfeited was immense, which clearly, $1.3 million in today's money just for Brigham Young alone, that's immense, I would have to say. Brigham Young publicly condemned the counterfeiting operation, but as John Turner states in his biography, it remains unclear whether Young had sanctioned the bogus making operation. Well, later on in the podcast, we are going to prove to you that not only did Brigham Young sanction it, but it was going on in his compound in Utah. So even though he claims that it's unclear, it's not unclear. They had absolute proof that this was happening right under Brigham Young's nose. So we will show that evidence that he was deeply involved. It's pretty undeniable. For those who are not aware, following the events at Carthage Jail in 1845, law enforcement uncovered an extensive and sophisticated counterfeiting operation that had been going on in Nauvoo. So it goes from Nauvoo and transfers over into Utah. After the discovery of this sophisticated operation, indictments were issued for the leaders of the Mormon Church.
Mm-hmm. And about the same time, the Nauvoo Charter was repealed, and it was repealed in January of 1845. And this was primarily due to increasing tensions between the Mormons and the non-Mormons in Illinois. Citizens of the surrounding cities voiced major concerns about the concentration of power within the city of Nauvoo, which had grown in size to rival Chicago in population. The Nauvoo Charter gave Joseph Smith and the leaders of the Mormon Church considerable control over the local government, including the Nauvoo Legion, which was a large, well-armed Mormon militia. This created a lot of fear that Nauvoo was turning into a theocratic state. The city's unique legal powers, including issuing writs of habeas corpus, were seen as a way to protect Joseph Smith and other Mormon leaders from being subject to legitimate legal proceedings for their crimes. The Mormon leadership's control over the Nauvoo Legion, which was the largest militia in Illinois at that time, and their tendency to vote as a bloc in state elections led to suspicions of both political manipulation and dangerous access to military power. This stoked fears among non-Mormons that the Mormons sought to establish their own government. Ultimately, the Illinois legislature voted to repeal the charter, effectively dismantling the city's autonomy and setting the stage for the eventual expulsion of the Mormons from Illinois in 1846. So, with the repeal of the Nauvoo Charter, they lost their courts, their police, their militia, which left them vulnerable to attacks by mobs. But more importantly, it left unscrupulous leaders of the church vulnerable because they would no longer be able to have their court cases be heard in the Nauvoo court stacked with members of the church. And of course, it's members of the church that are not going to rule against their own leaders. And
Yeah.
the indictment of Brigham Young and other church leaders, combined with notice from Governor Ford that troops were planning to prevent the Mormons from leaving the area, led Brigham Young to arrange for the church members to begin leaving Nauvoo in February of 1846. And this is not an ideal time to be leaving and traveling long distances heading out to west, because there are frigid temperatures. They didn't want to wait till spring because of these indictments against the church leaders. The Nauvoo counterfeiting was reportedly well known along the Mississippi River, and as information surfaced pointing to leaders of the Mormon Church being deeply involved in this operation, the leaders of the church tried to throw Joseph H. Jackson under the bus, saying he took part in the illegal counterfeiting. These claims were in part an attempt to discredit Joseph Jackson and his statements against the leaders of the church. And here we've got several paragraphs from the Chicago Tribune, and it's from one of their reporters out in the Utah Territory at that time. And it starts out by saying, we have from our Utah correspondent the following relative to the attempted fraud on the U.S. Treasury by means of forged checks. the plate for which was engraved by Mackenzie an account of ineligible. No one was able to read what that says. So, account of ineligible trial, which we printed yesterday. It had been known here for several weeks that the work of counterfeiting checks on the United States Treasury was being carried on by some persons to the public unknown. Measures were once taken to expose the matter, and on Saturday last we succeeded in arresting one of those engaged in it while yet in his bed in the little town of Fairfield near this garrison. And the following morning another was arrested in Salt Lake City, 40 miles north of this. Both persons are now in irons.
Yeah, this gets really interesting. So we're just going to continue on with this report published in the Chicago Tribune. And he continues on. I send you herewith correct copies of the inventories of the goods and effects taken from persons, trunks, shops, and offices of the persons which you are requested to use in such manner as you may deem best for the interest of the government and of the public at large. The whole matter of detection of final arrests has been managed with remarkable skill and perfection from the beginning, and has created a stir among the saints not known since the days of Kirtland, Nauvoo, and Cleveland. The inventories explain themselves, and I have little to add save a word of explanation to those at a distance. Mr. Brewer, one of the prisoners, made the false step which enabled his intended victims to detect him. He is a fine-looking specimen of a Mormon saint, has been in Utah some 6 years, and was recommended by our friend Brigham Young himself, as is asserted as a safe, reliable man for this business. So here's Brigham Young recommending someone for counterfeiting. So we can't say that he didn't know or that he was not approving of it, because he's recommending to these agents, these law enforcement people, he's recommending someone for it. So continuing on. Still, it thus far appears that he had only a subordinate part to play, and in this he was unfortunate. The other, Mackenzie, is also a fine specimen of a Scotch mechanic, the best engraver beyond doubt in the United States. What's an engraver? A counterfeiter. Okay. He is also a devout Mormon saint. Came here some 8 years ago and has been constantly in Brigham Young's employ at his trade. What does that mean? He is the best engraver or the best counterfeiter in the United States, and he's in the employment of Brigham Young. The inventory of effects found in his room, which was attached to Brigham Young's private office, it was in the tithing banking house. So they are counterfeiting out of the tithing house, and all inside of the palace walls, which means Brigham Young's palace or compound. This was all being done. Will serve to indicate the occupation he has been engaged in since his arrival in Zion. After he was arrested and the property taken possession of, Brigham Young sent his head clerk to say, to the marshal that he had desired the property be not removed, as it belonged to the president of the church, Brigham Young. His request was not heeded, however, and the whole budget, prisoner and all, were put en route to this place and delivered over to Judge Eckel, Chief Justice of the territory. These inventories will doubtless recall to the minds of some in Illinois, Missouri, and Ohio events past, and may be the means of saving the United States Treasury from a great fraud, because we are still in doubt as to the extent of this matter. Colonel Crossman's checks on the assistant treasurers at New York, here's our second connection, and St. Louis have been copied with a degree of perfection to baffle detection. And the exact date, number, person's name, and amount, and lastly his signature, so perfectly copied as to pass current even with Colonel Crossman himself. We still hope, however, that no great amount has been, and then again this word was illegible, afloat. We cannot yet speak on this matter. Evidence sufficient has been evolved, however, to say that it has been a most tremendous and startling attempt to some extent successful to defraud the treasury of the country and also individuals. Also, that its origin is inside Brigham Young's palace walls. This is written in the Chicago Tribune. Okay. And the engraving, which is truly beautiful, done by his own employee. And that the strictest injunctions were given that no Mormon was to pass a check entirely filled out, and that none less than $500 were to be issued. And lastly, that 2/3 of the profits were to the church or its presidency. So here we are having 2/3 of their counterfeiting profits were to go to the church or the presidency of the church. The trial, which was preliminary, will take place in a few days. And if practical, you shall be advised of the evidence and disclosures authentically. The inventories mentioned above make mention of notes on the Kirtland Safety Society Bank, Deseret Currency Association, Nauvoo Trust Association, Bank of Gallipolis, Ohio, Jackson County Bank, Michigan, Bank of Wisconsin, Green Bay, Ann Arbor Bank, Michigan Bank of Mineral Point, together with a great variety of other stuff common to an engraver's establishment. What bundles of the notes mentioned above, what are they doing in Utah? Who can tell? Whew. Okay, so that was a mouthful. But to summarize, they have extensive evidence of a counterfeiting ring that was operating under the direction of Brigham Young on Brigham Young's property. When they use the term engraver, just remember that they're referring to a counterfeiter.
And it'd been known for quite a period of time that there had been a ring of counterfeiting checks on the U.S. territory, and an informant tipped off the feds of this counterfeiting ring. The informant named Brewer, who, as stated in the Chicago Tribune's article, was a faithful Mormon saint. The feds caught Brewer through what appears to be some sort of sting operation, and in the article, and the feds then follow the trail back to the master engraver David Mackenzie, who was described as a faithful Mormon saint who operated his counterfeiting office in a room directly connected to Brigham Young's office with Brigham Young's Brigham Young's compound, or as the article calls it, Brigham Young's palace.
Oh, of course. His palace.
I'm
So
sure
fitting for the arrogant Brigham Young.
Exactly. And the feds gathered a large quantity of evidence directly from Brigham Young's compound. And at the end of this article, the question is posed, what on earth are the notes from all these banks doing in Utah in the Mormon tithing office and throughout Brigham Young's compound? Three men were arrested in association with the evidence collected. It was Wallace, Brewer, and Mackenzie. Brigham Young then demands that the U.S. Marshal return all of the materials taken from the office, as he claims they belong to the president of the church. And Wallace and Brewer, they actually cooperated with the feds, and Wallace refused to testify before a grand jury in August.
Yeah, so they cooperated until he ended up having to fully testify before the grand jury.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah.
And he actually sent a letter to the judge claiming that he wanted to testify, but he and his wife had received death threats.
It was probably a day-night thing.
Probably.
Yeah.
And the judge responds to this report stating about what it says about the lack of law in Utah and that terror rules. Because
I think that's really key that you have a judge saying that terror rules in Utah, because it is so accurate.
Absolutely.
We'll get into that in later podcasts, but it is very accurate.
Absolutely. And remember that this was August of 1859, when Brigham Young was both the prophet of the Mormon Church and the governor of Utah. So we absolutely did have not only religious control, but also political and control over Utah. And again, it just drives in the stake more about how terror rules in Utah. And in April of 1860, the press reported that Wallace had left Utah with a group of gamblers, while Myron Brewer was assassinated in the streets of Salt Lake City. So again, we've got terror ruling in Utah.
Yeah.
Deseret News reported on this assassination, calling it a kill that was thorough and scientific. The shooter was a pro in the business who knew Myron Brewer well. This appears to have been a day-night killing, which was very common at this time in Utah. And we actually did an episode on the day nights, so you can go check out one of our previous episodes on the day nights. That'll also be linked down below in the description. So Myron Brewer would have definitely been on Brigham Young's radar because he was privy to Brigham Young's illegal counterfeiting operation, and Brigham Young could not have Myron Brewer testifying against him. So as you continue to dig into the Mormon counterfeiting operations that began with Joseph Smith Sr. and the evidence trail that takes you all the way to Brigham Young's compound in Utah in 1859, you begin to see the Mormon connection to the Bonlada counterfeiting gang, and that it was active in late 1857 through summer of 1871. So both Joseph Smith Jr. and Brigham Young were heavily involved in counterfeiting. So you may ask, how do you make the connection between the Bonlada operation and the Mormon counterfeiting schemes? Many of Monroe's founders who benefited from the Bonlada criminal counterfeiting were originally from Vermont during that same time, and Joseph Smith Jr.'s crew of treasure diggers and counterfeiters were at their peak in New York and Vermont as well. The high-level printing technology used by Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, as well as the Bonlada counterfeiting ring, relied on the same printing technology from the same geographic area. This printing technology was used in Joseph's Kirkland Safety Society bank fraud scam, as well as Brigham Young's counterfeit ring. And the last bit of evidence that Mormon leaders had a connection to the Bonlada gang is the fact that the gang operated predominantly in Mormon areas without the use of violence, indicating there was maybe some level of connection because there's no way otherwise they would reside peacefully together. And New York City was a hotspot for counterfeiters, and Joseph Smith, along with other leaders of the church, would have had ample opportunity to obtain counterfeit money as they made several trips into the city.
Yes, and as we will see later, the Brigham Young actually had, or his family actually had, an apartment there. Okay, so more evidence of the counterfeiting connection comes from William Hall, who joined the Mormon Church in 1840 and published information about how Joseph Smith obtained counterfeit bills. And he states, they would go, some of them, to distant banks in the United States where they had an understanding. And they would purchase at $10 per hundred such quantities of bank bills of that bank, completely engraved but unsigned, as they might want for circulation. These were taken home, and of course, the president and cashier's name signed onto them in the most correct style. As we have discussed, these counterfeiting rings relied on New York technology, and they had to have financial contacts in New York, or they would not have been able to obtain the high-quality engraving technology that they needed to counterfeit the money. Joseph Smith's family had been involved in, as we said, quote, passing bills since at least 1807. With Joseph Smith Sr. And then Joseph Smith Jr. became involved in the operation around the late 1820s. Brigham Young was obviously involved in this, and it's believed that it was continued until his death in 1877. One very interesting fact in the Mormon counterfeiting fiasco is that the Smith family were acquainted with many printers in the area, and the Book of Mormon was first printed near Manchester, Vermont. This was a location well known for the printing of counterfeit money during the same time as the printing of the Book of Mormon, which I just find that fascinating. Many faithful members are not aware that the Young family had ties to New York toward the beginning of the 20th century. Officials in New York City viewed Mormons and the family of Brigham Young as nothing more than a, quote, mafia-style criminal organization. Why would they hold this view? Mormons will want to jump to their usual claims of religious persecution and all of that, but that would be entirely incorrect. The Mormons deserve every ounce of the reputation that they had. Let's discuss the unaliving that was committed by William Hooper Young, who was the grandson of Brigham Young. What a coincidence that Brigham Young's grandson happens to be in New York City, the center of counterfeiting operations. In 1902, Hooper Young was involved in the infamous Pulitzer, let's say, unaliving, okay, in New York City. The victim was Anna Pulitzer, and she was found in the Morris Canal in New Jersey, and evidence linked her death to an apartment that was owned by Hooper Young's father, John Willard Young. On September 19th, 1902, as I stated, the body of Anna Pulitzer was found in the Morris Canal outside Jersey City, New Jersey. Her abdomen had been stabbed and there was bruising on her head. Pulitzer was a married woman, but she had been arrested multiple times for solicitation of prostitution. It was very interesting that she had been with Brigham Young's grandson. A New York cab man was found who claimed that a few days previously he had taken Anna and an unknown man to an apartment in New York City. That apartment came to an understanding that it was the home of Hooper Young's father, John Willard Young. In the apartment, police found empty beer bottles, and I want to stop right here. They found what? This is in the 1900s. Beer is considered against the word of wisdom, according to LDS members. So they find empty beer bottles, a bottle with chloral hydrate crystals in it, a carving knife with blood on it, and blood on bed sheets in a closet, under the kitchen sink, and on the floor and walls of this apartment. So this is Brigham Young's son's apartment. Also, the words blood atonement were scrawled in a notebook, and underneath were several references to verses in the Bible that discuss atonement for crime. It was determined that Pulitzer had died of a drug overdose from chloral poisoning. So they found the chloral hydrate crystals in the apartment. So she was actually killed from being poisoned with this chloral hydrate, and that the head bruising and abdomen stabbing had occurred after her death. Hooper Young was arrested, tried, and eventually pled guilty to second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment for the crime. This case caused a media frenzy due to his connection to the prominent Mormon Young family. And there was speculation surrounding possible motives for the murder. And there were rumors that it possibly could have been blood atonement because of the notebook that was found that discussed blood atonement. And if you kind of understand, obviously, Brigham Young's grandson had picked up this woman who was known for solicitation of prostitution, and she is then unalived in this apartment. It becomes quite clear what was going on. Whether or not it was truly a, quote, blood atonement, we don't know. But clearly what they had done in that apartment would have definitely fallen under Brigham Young's kind of rules for what would require blood atonement for forgiveness. But obviously leaders of the church were never blood atoned for anything they did. It was just be the other people involved. Mm-hmm. And so we don't know. We'll let you decide that.
Yeah, absolutely. And here on the bottom of the slide, we got a list of all of the newspaper articles that are talking about this case. And this is where we get the evidence that we're talking about here. And the ritual-esque unaliving of Anna Pulitzer, along with the gory details of blood atonement enacted by the Danites at the command of Brigham Young, gave authorities ample evidence to hold the view that Mormons were a mafia-style organization, which, again, we've talked about in our previous video on the Danites. This connection in New York that continues to pop up in Mormon history brings a common connection to crime syndicates in New York and Mormon church leaders' criminal activity. So Brigham Young actually had federal marshals trying to find and arrest him for counterfeiting. Not because he was Mormon, not because of religious persecution or anything, but because he was involved in criminal activity. Brigham had several of his inner circle dress up like him, including Porter Rockwell, accompanied by fake polygamous wives, in an effort to evade law enforcement. And evidence suggests counterfeiting was practiced on a massive scale. Brigham Young and the other leaders flee Nauvoo, moving to Iowa to avoid capture. They left 3 trustees behind in Nauvoo to bring the stereotype plates for the Doctrine and Covenants to winter quarters. But the plates were never used again and were considered lost. Governor Thomas Ford allegedly sought to protect Brigham Young and other church leaders from the counterfeiting charges. His efforts to protect church leaders has led to speculation that Governor Ford may have been benefiting from the money laundering and counterfeiting operations. However, eventually federal marshals got involved in the case, and the governor could no longer afford to intervene. At this point, the Mormons had to leave Nauvoo. And the fact that the plates used for printing the Doctrine and Covenants conveniently go missing right after the charges of counterfeiting are issued strongly indicates that the plates were probably used for other purposes and did not simply go missing. And I find it interesting that federal marshals attempt to arrest Brigham Young on counterfeiting charges in late 1845, and then the Mormons begin their exodus in early 1846. I wonder why. Like we said earlier, they left in February of 1846 in awful freezing temperatures. You wouldn't leave at that time unless you were actually running from something. And in February of 1846, Governor Ford sent a letter to Brigham Young notifying him that the United States Army had plans to prevent the Mormons from leaving Nauvoo and escaping the United States into Mexican territory. Brigham Young began to immediately evacuate the city. So, of course, he's going to want to evacuate because they're going to trap him in. Interestingly, many people believe that it was simply due to religious persecution. But as we've detailed today, the criminal activity of church leaders and the indictments of these leaders are pretty obviously the reason the United States Army and marshals may have become involved in preventing the Mormon leaders from escaping the U.S. And as we said earlier, Governor Ford was clearly involved in notifying Brigham Young so he could escape before authorities could catch up with him. And we don't know what was going through the mind of Governor Ford or why he would do such a thing. And that's another thing that we'll leave you guys to decide what actually happened.
Yeah, it was kind of an interesting little twist there. Among the list of those indicted, we find the name Peter Hawes, which we've mentioned earlier. As you review the manuscript history of Brigham Young, it becomes obvious that Peter Hawes was involved in the bogus business, which means counterfeiting. The documentation also shows that he was involved in counterfeiting after they escaped to Nauvoo. Klaus J. Hansen shows that Peter Hawes was a member of the Council of 50 under Joseph Smith, which is further evidence that this counterfeiting operation went all the way up to the higher echelons of the church. Brigham Young wrote the following on May 12, 1846. While I was standing with President Kimball at his tent, an outcry was heard from Peter Hawes' camp. We repaired thither and found that Hawes and Thomas Williams and 2 others had a quarrel about some property, that Hawes had let Williams have some bogus money on shares, and Williams had not paid him his share of the profits. So here we have counterfeit money that they're arguing about in May of 1846. I reproved them for dealing in base coin. What is he going to do? Admit that he's involved in counterfeiting too? Of course he's going to do this in public. I reproved them for dealing in base coin and told Hawes he could not govern himself, his family, or a company, and unless he repented and forsook such dishonesty, the hand of the Lord would be against him and all those who partook of such corruption. So, when the counterfeiting operation is exposed, though, so here's Brigham Young condemning this, and you better repent, or God is going to be against you, and all of his fiery rhetoric, as they call it. And then the counterfeiting operation is exposed. Brigham Young's denouncing it. But if you remember earlier, when federal agents removed the counterfeiting plates and other materials used for the counterfeiting from Brigham Young's compound in the office next to his, it becomes really ridiculous. He's very much involved. He's just concealing his own involvement in this corruption. In the history of the church, LDS historian B.H. Roberts refers to this incident, but he does not expose the fact that it was Peter Hawes who was involved in the bogus operation, so he doesn't name anybody. In the quarrel between Peter Hawes, Thomas Williams, and two other men, it becomes obvious that these men were deeply engaged in using bogus counterfeit money to exchange among settlers for goods. The quarrel was not about the fact that they were using counterfeit money, but simply that the profits being made from the shares in it weren't being distributed fairly. Well, how do you expect someone to be honest when they are clearly involved in illegal activity? I mean, obviously. Another reason that we cannot take Brigham Young's rebuke of Peter Hawes very seriously is that Hawes continued to serve in the Council of 50 in colonial Utah from 1847 to 1849. So clearly, Brigham Young, he was making these threats and statements, but he didn't really do anything about it. When we find that both Peter Hawes and Brigham Young were under indictment for counterfeiting at the same time this occurred, it throws a new light on this whole incident. So returning back to the rapid exodus from Nauvoo, according to the United States government records we referenced earlier, leaders of the Mormon church were leaving, obviously, because of being indicted for counterfeiting. They did not have the means to flee from Nauvoo in the dead of winter on very little notice, and therefore the leaders of the church had to hide from the U.S. Marshal during December and January until they could kind of make the preparations in order to leave in February, which they were planning to do so in the spring anyway, because the Nauvoo Charter had already been repealed. But when this came down, it forced their hand, and they just had to hurry and try to figure out how to get out. And so they just had to go into hiding until they could do that.
And in February of 1846, this is when they fled from Nauvoo and headed west due to the fact that the U.S. Army was now involved and were ordered to prevent the Mormons from fleeing the country. While the non-Mormons in surrounding areas were demanding that the Mormons leave Illinois, the indictments for counterfeiting put enough pressure on the church leaders to leave before they had originally planned in the spring. And we got warrants pending for the arrest of Brigham Young and other leaders. Let me jump back here. This is a statement from Kenneth W. Godfrey. And he says, quote, warrants pending for the arrest of Brigham Young and other leaders on charges of counterfeiting were among the reasons for the early departure of the saints from the city of Joseph in February rather than in the spring as originally proposed. Governor Ford makes a statement.
But that's also, just make the point, that is in the Brigham Young University studies in winter of 1968. So this is not just some random, some anti-something. No, this is actually in BYU studies where this statement was made that was among the reasons that they left. So we're not just, making random offhanded statements about this being a reason.
Absolutely. And this next statement is from the History of the Church, Volume 7. It's not like we're pulling random things from the internet. No, these are actual historical accounts that either from church or church-connected resources. So Governor Ford makes a statement regarding the charges of counterfeiting and the threatened arrests of the 12. It says, quote, indictments have been found against 9 of them in the Circuit Court of the United States for the District of Illinois at its December term, 1845, for counterfeiting the current coin of the United States. The United States Marshal had applied to me for militia force to arrest them, but in pursuance of the one amnesty agreed on for old offenses, believing that the arrest would prevent the removal of the Mormons, and that if arrested, there was not the least chance of any of them would ever be convicted. I declined the application unless regularly called upon by the President of the United States according to law. It was generally agreed upon that it would be impolitic to arrest the leaders and thus put an end to the preparations for removal, when it was notorious that none of them would be convicted, for if they always commanded evidence and witnesses enough to make a conviction impossible. But with a view to hasten their removal, they were made to believe that the president would order the regular army to Nauvoo as soon as the navigation opened in the spring. This had its intended effect. The 12, about 2,000 of their followers, immediately crossed the Mississippi before breaking of the ice. But before this deputy marshal had sought to arrest the accused without success. And also, we have a quick statement from Samuel Brannan, who wrote a letter to Brigham Young, and where he stated, Mr. Benson thinks the 12 should leave and get out of the country first and avoid being arrested if it's a possible thing. But if you are arrested, you will find a staunch friend in him. We've got so many statements here of Brigham Young and members of the church, the 12, all fleeing to avoid getting arrested for the illegal activities. And again, this letter is in the history of the church.
Yeah, there's a lot of evidence to this. And, if you're not guilty and you're not, all this running, all this hiding and everything, it wasn't persecution. There were reasons. And then we also find that the indictment documents are destroyed in a fire. It's just a crazy, wild ride going through this. Anyway, on January 24th, 1846, Brigham Young made these statements. He says, a set of bogus makers who recently commenced operations in this city, who are determined to counterfeit coin here by wagon loads, at least admitting it's wagon loads worth of money, are determined to be revenged upon us because we would not permit them to pursue their wicked business in Nauvoo. They have scattered through the country, circulating their bogus money and spreading lies and every species of falsehood, saying that we are engaged in bogus making in order thereby to conceal their crimes and screen themselves from observation and punishment, and at the same time be avenged upon us for not consenting to the establishment of their bogus mints at Nauvoo. And this is in the history of the church. Okay, this is the problem I have with this. So Brigham Young is making this statement about these wicked people, and they're spreading falsehoods and trying to say that they were involved in these crimes. I'm like, why the hell is the counterfeiting equipment found in your compound in an office next to yours and a man that you are employing? Like, clearly you are involved in this. And he's, they're trying to conceal their crimes and blame us. I'm like, oh my word. It's absolutely ridiculous because there's so much evidence against him, and we will continue on to other court cases. The issue with Brigham Young's continued condemnation of these bogus makers is that if the Mormons were truly not involved in counterfeiting, the exodus from Nauvoo would have ended it, right? These counterfeiters would have, like he said, scattered around. It would have ended this whole matter. If Brigham Young was not involved in the counterfeiting, why was the most skilled counterfeiter in the United States found working for Brigham Young in Utah? And why did the feds find counterfeiting equipment in Brigham Young's compound in Utah? Going back to the argument that leaving Nauvoo should have ended the matter of counterfeiting among the Mormons if they were not involved, leaving Nauvoo absolutely did not end the matter. As they headed west, the charges of counterfeiting continued. Brigham Young frankly admitted that Peter Hawes, who was a member of the Council of 50, was involved in counterfeiting. In a letter written on April 5th, 1846, Brigham Young stated, I have some men in the company that are thieves and bogus makers, and bogus men any way you put them. And this is in the manuscript history of Brigham Young. Brigham Young fully admits that there are counterfeiters among them. He knows it. On April 12th, 1846, Brigham Young also states, but there had been some things done which were wrong. There were among us those who were passing counterfeit money and had done it all the time since we left Nauvoo. There were men among us who would steal. Again, in the history of the church. Here we have a clear statement by Brigham Young that counterfeiting had been going on among the members of the Mormon church even after they left Nauvoo. And he is clearly aware of it because he keeps stating that he knows about this. William Hall, who had been a member of the church, made these statements concerning counterfeiting among the Mormons. And he says, quote, the bogus money, as next in dignity, claims our consideration. In this brother Turley shone conspicuous at bogus, he could not be surpassed. A press was prepared, and the money, composed of zinc, glass, etc., coated with silver, was executed in the best style. The people at large were liberally endowed with it. So basically, the people are liberally endowed with counterfeit money.
here we have a very clear statement that not only are they counterfeiting money, but people were given lots of this bogus money. So we'll go on with William's statement, and he continues on to say, when leaving Illinois for Council Bluffs, I hauled in my wagon for some distance on the way a bogus press. So, in case you guys don't know, a bogus press is how that counterfeit money was printed. And he goes on to implicate leaders of the church, as he states, the secret object of the leaders, even at the time, was the Valley of the Salt Lake. The press was afterwards sold on a credit in Missouri, but the vendor was afraid to go for his money. William Hall is implicating the leaders of the church in his counterfeiting operation that they had a secret object to make it to the Salt Lake Valley, which was outside of the United States at this time. William continues on by saying, during my sojourn among them, I had occasion to seek employment among the farmers of Missouri. I labored a short time for one who lived on the disputed territory. And one day he told me that he had just sold a yoke of oxen and a cow for, I think, $35. He showed me the money, which was paper money, and he asked me if I thought it was good. I inquired of whom he had received it, but he could not recollect the man. I asked him to describe him. He did so. I pronounced the name of Thomas Williams. That was the name. I said if he got the money from him, I expected it was bad, and he was a notorious cheat and seldom dealt in any other than counterfeit money. I advised him to go down to the camp and go right to Brigham Young and demand from him the cattle, stating that he had got some bad money from Williams. I told him he must never mention my name, and if he should see me in camp or elsewhere, not to recognize me, or I might be in danger. I told him, moreover, that he must not accept anything like the former price, but exactly $60 or $65 for the oxen and $10 for the cow. And he goes on to say at Garden Grove in southern Iowa, somewhere near on the disputed territory, we buried 2 bogus presses, which I carried in on my own wagon, with a barrel of rosin and materials belonging thereto, amounting in weight to about 1,000 pounds. The reason assigned for this proceeding was that they wanted them on their return, as they would be available to press good money. The inference was that when they returned, it would be as conquerors of the United States, and that then, having the political power in their hands, they would coin good money. Garden Grove had its name given to it by the Mormons. Like, they're literally saying that they are going to, when they returned, it would be as conquerors of the United States. How can you be any less direct than that?
Yeah, this was part of Joseph Smith's scheming, trying to run for president of the United States. They really wanted this power, and they were very confident in it and insistent that they were going to have it. So here we have this statement that they buried 2 of the presses used for printing counterfeit money, and then they would return for them once they were, as we said, conquerors of the United States, and the political power would then be in their hands, and they could again coin money. But this time they claimed it would apparently be good money. So then we have Mrs. Mary Etty B. Smith. She gives information concerning the counterfeiting, and she says this, quote, another thing that increased the prejudice against our community was the great amount of bogus money afloat about that time, and in some cases traced directly to the Mormons. It so happened that while at Nauvoo and afterwards, I had an opportunity to know something of this bogus manufacture. When we were on the route through Iowa, it occurred that one day when one of the wagons was upset, the press for making bogus money rolled into sight, and it was seen by many Mormons, who till then had not supposed that they were one of a gang of counterfeiters. There you go, claiming that these Mormons are a gang of counterfeiters. But there is no doubt about the fact that the business of counterfeiting was carried on extensively, and that too under the personal sanction and blessing of the prophet Joseph and of the 12, in which Brigham Young would have been a part of at this time. Most of these 12 apostles are now living at Salt Lake, and the same is true today there, although not done openly and justified as the spiritual wife practice. Even this was denied at Nauvoo to the Gentiles, while it was taught us under the ban of secrecy. One thing is certain, this bogus press was carried to my certain knowledge to Salt Lake, and there is now a man living in Allegheny County by the name of Lewis Wood who saw it between Nauvoo and Council Bluffs. She clearly states that most Mormons had no idea they were a part of a gang of counterfeiters, and that this counterfeiting business was carried out extensively under the sanction of Joseph Smith and the 12 apostles, including Brigham Young. And therefore, Brigham Young, being a member of the 12 apostles at this time, would be privy to the knowledge of these counterfeiting operations, in which later proof would be found in his compound. We move on to another statement by Mrs. Smith about the Mormons robbing from the Gentiles and counterfeiting. And Mrs. Smith says the notorious gamblers of this region among the Gentiles, somewhat famed about this time, stood no chance with this band of Mormons, for they were professedly strangers. They had a system of secret signs by which they were understood by each other, and they could thus play into the hands of their friends unsuspected. The horses and other booty purchased or stolen was forwarded at once to Canesville, and was there received by none other than Orson Hyde, who, after sorting it, forwarded it on to the plains, or made such disposition of it as would place it beyond the reach of the Gentiles, in case suspicion should be directed towards them. Orson Hyde is one of the 12 apostles, and is often in the United States. There are now many persons living by whom these facts can be proved. The bogus money used by these men was made mostly out of Nauvoo, but I have heretofore mentioned that the press used in its manufacture was taken west and on to Salt Lake in the wagon of Peter Hawes. So here we have Peter Hawes again, and was at this time at Canesville. This man, Hawes, is now living on Humboldt River west of the Great Salt Lake City.
This is another clear statement that Orson Hyde, while he was an acting member of the 12 apostles of the church, he's receiving stolen property, which indicates that the church leaders fully endorse stealing from non-Mormons, or what they call the Gentiles. And here we got a journal entry from John Bennon, and this was on October 13th, 1860. He says, quote, "After meeting council and Elder Hyde had a long talk in my house, Brother Hyde said, speaking of stealing, that a man may steal and be influenced by the Spirit of the Lord to do it. That Hickman had done it years past, and said he never would institute a trial against a brother for stealing from the Gentiles, but stealing from his brethren, he was down on it." Here they're saying like, oh, they're influenced from the Spirit. It's the Spirit telling them to steal from these Gentiles. So it's a spirit. It's okay. And
Yeah.
Mrs. Smith states that a bogus press was hauled west in the wagon of Peter Hawes. This statement is corroborated with the facts that Peter Hawes, who again was a member of the Council of 50, was indicted along with the Mormon leaders for counterfeiting. Brigham Young admitted that while the Mormons were coming west, Hawes had let Williams have some bogus money on shares. The evidence and statements of so many people indicating the counterfeiting operations of leaders of the Mormon Church are vast and paint a completely different picture than the LDS Church tries to maintain. These are anything but holy men of God, and their illegal practices didn't stop after they had to flee Nauvoo before the U.S. Army caught up with them. They arrive in Salt Lake Valley and continue to mint bogus gold coins. Dr. Will made this statement concerning these coins. He says, quote, "Should you come to Utah, reader, some old Mormon or apostate will show you the gold coins of Zion, coined by Brigham Young. Even this official money of the kingdom, now out of course, is counterfeit. It bears on its face $5, and is in reality only worth about $4.30. And then in his book, Counterfeiting Mistook and Unofficial U.S. Coins, this is by Don Taxay, he stated, in the midst of the boom, the citizens received a rude shock. A series of assay tests taken by Eckfeldt and Du Bois at the Philadelphia Mint reveals that almost all of the coins in circulation were debased. The Mormon gold, whose coining was supervised by none other than Brigham Young, was found to be wanted by as much as 20% that of the Pacific Co. by even more. And as we've detailed all of the counterfeiting evidence of the early Mormons, we've given you statements of LDS historian B.H. Roberts.
Yeah, the evidence is really thick, and obviously in an hour and a half or so of a podcast, we can't even get into all of it, but we found that this was the most weighty evidence and starting to paint this picture. In 1859, the Mormon people again found themselves in serious trouble because of the exposure of a counterfeiting operation. So they're leaving in 1845 because of an indictments for counterfeiting. And now we're in 1859 and they're in trouble again. So this is why I say Brigham Young, we have the evidence that he's been involved with this counterfeiting stuff probably up until his death. We have evidence in for decades of this. And this is LDS historian B.H. Roberts gives this information regarding this matter. He says, 2 incidents happened in the troublesome fall of 1859 that threatened for a time to bring on a conflict between the citizens of Utah and the Army at Camp Floyd. One of these is known as the Spencer Pike affair. The other was a plot to arrest Brigham Young in connection with a case of alleged counterfeiting of government drafts. So here we go again. He's constantly being accused of counterfeiting, which obviously we've seen the evidence that he was in fact involved. The facts in the counterfeiting case referred to in the opening paragraph of this chapter, in which it was sought to involve President Young, are as follows. A party of men in Camp Floyd, prominent among whom were M. Brewer and J.M. Wallace, conspired to counterfeit United States quartermaster orders on St. Louis and New York. In pursuance of this purpose, they employed a young Mormon engraver of Salt Lake City to duplicate the quartermaster's plate at Camp Floyd. This was skillfully accomplished and the counterfeit bills printed upon. The forgery was soon discovered, and the principal in the crime, Brewer, was arrested at Camp Floyd. He promptly turned state's evidence by confessing and threw responsibility for the crime upon the young Mormon engraver, and implicated a person in Brigham Young's office for having furnished the paper for the counterfeit notes. So again, we're having connections with Brigham Young's office. The engraver's tools and engraving paraphernalia were all seized by Mr. Dotson, the United States Marshal, and the young engraver was arrested. Afterwards, when visiting the engraver's regular workshop, where he had done work for Brigham Young on the Deseret currency plates, these plates were also seized by Mr. Dotson and carried to Camp Floyd. The confession and allegation of Brewer seems to bring this crime so close to the premises of President Young that it was hoped at Camp Floyd that he could be implicated. In pursuance of this purpose, to make the crime stick on Brigham Young, a plan for his arrest was arranged. The plan was to issue a writ for the arrest of Brigham Young as well as the young Mormon engraver, and apprehending that there would be resistance to the arrest of the former, the army was to be ordered into Salt Lake City. Johnston's artillery was to make a breach in the wall surrounding the ex-governor's premises. Then the troops would sally forth, seize Brigham Young by force, and hurry him to Camp Floyd. And this is in a comprehensive history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Volume 4.
The biggest issue here involving legal action against Brigham Young is that he had complete control over the church. He was the governor of Utah, and he had control over the courts. And we will detail in a statement by Judge Cradlebraugh out of Provo, Utah, later in this podcast. So we'll get into that in a moment. But first, we have another statement by LDS historian B.H. Roberts. He goes on to say, "Words indeed was brought from Camp Floyd by an express rider from Camp Floyd that 2 regiments would be ordered that night on a forced march to Salt Lake City to make arrests, whereon Governor Cummings, it is said, gave orders to General D.H. Wells of the Utah militia to be ready with a force to repulse the federal troops. And this General Wells so promptly responded to that by 2 o'clock on Monday morning, 5,000 men were under arms.
So these men were men that were going to fight against the army that was coming to arrest Brigham Young. Mm-hmm. Just to make that clear.
Thank you. And it goes on to say that the young Mormon engraver of the counterfeit plates of the foregoing incident was put on trial, found guilty, and sentenced to prison for 2 years. Marshal Dotson, in taking forceful possession of the currency plates belonging to Brigham Young, exceeded his duties as an officer. While in charge, they were marred to the point of ruining them. In this condition, the marshal sought to return them to their owner, but President Young refused to receive them and brought suit against Marshal Dotson for the illegal seizure and injury of the currency plates. After a long and tedious trial, President Young obtained judgment of damages to the extent of $2,600, for which property in Salt Lake City was sold to satisfy. It was this circumstance which finally led to Marshal Dotson's resignation and removal from Utah.
You don't go up against Brigham Young.
Oh, no, you don't.
In Utah. You don't. And $2,600 was absolutely ridiculous.
Absolutely. And you may believe that this is the end of it. Brigham Young wins a court case against the U.S. Marshal for damaging his counterfeiting plates and awarded the $2,600. And this money is wildly excessive. And as we'll detail further in just a second, what you need to understand is that Brigham Young had control over the courts and therefore was guaranteed not only to win that case, but guaranteed this outrageous sum of money as well. So now let's really drive home the truth about Brigham Young with a statement by Judge Cradlebaugh.
Yeah, so I want to be very clear before we get into this statement by Judge John Cradlebaugh. He served in Utah. He served in Provo, Utah. And these statements were from a speech delivered in the House of Representatives on February 7th, 1863. So this is not anti-Mormon stuff. This is not hearsay. This is not whatever. This is from a judge speaking in front of the House of Representatives. And this is what he says about Utah, Brigham Young, and this situation, this lawsuit against the U.S. Marshal. And we will learn very quickly in his statement that this was absolutely ridiculous. So he says, with the history of one or more cases, I will conclude. In the summer of 1858, David Mackenzie was arrested, charged with engraving plates for counterfeiting government drafts on the Treasury at St. Louis. The evidence showed that the engraving had been done in the upper part of the Deseret store in Salt Lake City. This store is within the enclosure of Brigham Young's premises, the same being walled in with a stone wall some 12 or 14 feet in height. Judge Eccles, who issued the warrant, directed the marshal, his name was Peter K. Dotson, to seize the plates and any other matter that might be found in the room where the engraving had been done, which would establish the offense. The marshal accordingly went to the room and seized the plate. He also found another plate there, belonging, as it since appears, to Brigham Young, and used for striking off the Deseret currency, and observing that the copper plate upon which the counterfeit engraving had been made had been cut off one side of Brigham Young's Deseret currency plate, he brought away with him the currency plate. After the trial, Brigham refused to take them back, but brought his action against the marshal, P.K. Dotson, in the probate court. Probate courts throughout the territory held in violation of the Organic Act are dignified into courts of co-equal jurisdiction with the federal courts. It is one of Brigham Young's methods of destroying and nullifying the federal courts. He installs into these probate courts his most devoted creatures. An appeal can be made from these courts to the district court, but the appeal is almost always refused. I defy the delegate to show that Brigham ever brought an action in one of these creature courts of his in which he did not succeed. Of course, he obtained a judgment against Marshall Dotson for some $2,600. It would have been much more if he had only said the word. An appeal is refused. Execution is issued. Dotson's property is sold, and he is turned out of his house, a property that would rent for $500 per annum, Brigham's agent having bought it in. Thus, a good, efficient officer is ruined in Utah for having faithfully endeavored to prevent fraud upon the government treasury. I have the plates here, and then he shows them to the House of Representatives. I have shown them to engravers in the city, and they tell me the original cost of making them could not be more than $500 or $600, and say that they can be put in as good order as ever they were for $25. No stronger evidence could be adduced showing the absolute control of Brigham Young over the courts of Utah. So here we have a judge from Utah speaking in the House of Representatives in 1863, showing members of the House the counterfeiting plates removed from Brigham Young's property, and then making statements that Brigham Young never lost a case in his probate courts that he had stacked with his own members. He controlled these courts. He then tells us that these plates, just to get brand spanking new plates made, would have cost maybe $500. But he could have had them repaired for $25. And yet Brigham Young receives a $2,600 settlement for this. Then this U.S. Marshal's property is sold. He's kicked out of his house, and he is tossed out of Utah. Why do you think this happened? This is another one of Brigham Young's extremely illegal ways. And this is why they say Utah was basically under a reign of terror, because this is how Brigham Young handled anyone. And in fact, most of the time it ended up being a day-night killing, let's be real. But this is how you were handled going up against him. He is absolutely acting like a mob boss. You go against him, he will destroy you. And that is exactly what he did to this U.S. Marshal. And this is exactly what this judge is claiming in front of the U.S. House of Representatives.
Absolutely. And here we got one final piece of evidence in the counterfeiting operations of Brigham Young. So here we got some court testimony, and this was on July 20th, 1859. It was printed in the Valley Tan. This was an article printed. And it says, on Wednesday morning at 10 o'clock, Judge Eccles held a court in the theater to make the primary examination in the case of forgery of quartermaster checks on the Treasury. Judge Sinclair and Cradlebaugh were present. Myron Brewer, who was admitted as state's evidence, was first called. So after being duly sworn in, he makes the following statements. He resided in Salt Lake City for 3 or 4 years. In the month of May, he met Mackenzie on the street. In course of conversation, a plate was mentioned, and about 4 weeks elapsed. So 4 weeks later, witness told Mackenzie he would consult his friend, Mr. J.M. Wallace, did so, and seemed to concede with the views of Mackenzie. Spoke to him. When Mackenzie said the thing was quashed, Mackenzie said that he must get some other party. He said Mr. John K. had spoken to him about it, didn't understand the behavior of Wallace after his return from Camp Floyd. He said was resolved to carry the thing out all hazards. And here we got a little back and forth between the court and the witness. Court asks, did he resign any reason? And he said he had scruples and must communicate with Mr. Young on the subject. Young gave him short answers. From this time, the plate progressed, received the plates from Mackenzie. So then the court asks, you state that Young said so-and-so. What Young? Witness responds, Brigham Young. The tithing office is on the west side of Young's house, is enclosed, and belongs to the church. Mackenzie stated that he could get some paper from a son-in-law of John K. George D. Watts, and got some paper for him. He lives in the city. He is the reporter for the church. A witness got a query from the Valley Tan office, but thought it was not used. So then the court continues on. Was there any agreement in writing as to the disposal of the proceeds? The witness says Mackenzie said he should not exact a receipt from Wallace for 2/3 of the proceeds. Nothing less than $500 was to be issued, and at first $1,000 was mentioned. Court, did he assign any reason for so large an amount? The witness responds that it may fall into the hands of the people of the territory. They wish the government to be the sufferers. Had seen Mackenzie at work in the upper room of the tithing office. He worked in the daytime. Everyone can have access in the room. There was some contrivance with the handle of the door, which gave notice of the approach of anyone, and the plate disappeared under a false windowsill. Mackenzie had made some plates for the church and the Deseret News office. He worked as a mechanic. The impression was taken of the plates by a hand press in the office in the tithing store. Mr. J.M. Wallace next stated that he had an interview with Mackenzie, who told him that Wallace was recommended to him by Mr. Brigham Young as a man to be trusted. And then we got Juanita Brooks states that a Mormon engraver, Mackenzie, quote, refused to implicate Brigham Young or anything else or anyone else, but took his sentence of imprisonment for 2 years. So this court case is a little tricky to understand, but essentially those loyal to Brigham Young, like Mackenzie, were willing to take the fall and face imprisonment for the counterfeiting operation, and yet Brigham Young, who was clearly deeply involved, escapes any responsibility and goes on to become the richest man in Utah with a net worth of around $600,000 at the time of his death. Let's put this in perspective real quick. If we convert that into today's money, it would be worth about $17.3 million. His control of the church, the state, the courts, kept him out of any legal trouble for his blood atonement carried out by the Danites, or his counterfeiting operations, or any of the other dishonest or illegal business practice he took part in. So stay tuned for our next episodes as we detail Brigham Young's life of being a sexual predator and a mafia-style crime boss ordering hits on disaffected Mormons, engaging in illegal and dishonest business practices, and much, much more. Yes, more truth of LDS history that you are not taught in Sunday school. So thank you all so much for watching. We really appreciate it. If you enjoyed, please make sure you subscribe. Check out our website where we also have blog posts that correspond with every video. We've got lots of amazing merch for you to check out. So again, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.